Tonight you are sailing into Ravenbay, a small coastal village where summer is too hot, the fish have started betraying everyone, and salt is worth more than comfort. Follow Ewan Reed as he counts supplies, navigates polite rivalries, and learns that survival is mostly routine, with a calm layer of sarcasm. 10 chapters of soft tension, quiet humour, and harsh Viking life made for sleep and steady listening. The Summer That Did Not Belong. Ravenbay woke the way it always did, with smoke in the roof beams and the quiet certainty that somebody had already been awake for hours. The longhouse had its own weather. Warmth pooled low, then climbed in slow layers, as if it had ambitions. The air carried last night's fire, last week's wool, and the faint hope that today might be less complicated than yesterday. Ewan Reed stayed still for a moment and listened to the small sounds that meant life was continuing. A laddie scraped against a pot, feet shuffled across packed earth. A baby complained about the injustice of being awake. Near the doorway, a dog sighed like an elder who had seen too much and expected nothing. Ewan had learned that if he did not move, someone might forget he existed. That was the dream. A quiet life, unnoticed, unassigned. Unfortunately, he had a face that suggested competence. He also had the bad luck of arriving in Ravenbay during a year where competence was in demand. He rolled off his bedding and took a breath that tasted like yesterday. Across the longhouse, Hakon Ashridge was already upright. Hakon did not wake up so much as he appeared, as if sleep never fully claimed him. His hair was tied back, his tunic already on, and his expression suggested he had been thinking about supplies while everyone else wasted time dreaming. Hakon gave a brief greeting. Ewan answered with the honest complaint that it still felt like night pretending to be morning. Hakon pointed out that the sun clearly disagreed. Ewan offered the opinion that the sun had been making poor choices lately. That was the first uncomfortable truth of the season. The sun had changed its habits. Spring had not been gentle, and summer had arrived like a guest who did not ask permission and did not plan to leave. The days were long, the air was warm in a way that felt wrong for this coast. Even the sea breeze came in tired, as if it had marched a great distance. In the old years, Ravenbay worried about cold. In this year, they worried about heat. Heat reached into stored food and made decisions. It encouraged mold. It invited flies. It made salt feel like treasure and clean water feel like a rumor. Ewan stepped outside and blinked at the brightness. The yard was already busy. Buckets moved from the stream in steady lines. Nets came in heavy and smelling of yesterday. Children ran errands and learned early that a settlement survived on movement. Nobody moved fast. Fast movement was for emergencies. Slow movement was for everything else. Near the storage shed, Sigrid Vale stood with her hands on her hips, staring at a pile of fish that looked like it had lost the will to impress anyone. Sigrid was small, steady, and alarming in the way quiet people can be. When she looked at a problem, the problem usually became smaller out of fear. She lifted a corner of cloth and revealed the truth. Some of the fish had turned, soft in the wrong places, dull in the wrong way. The smell was a warning delivered politely, as if the rot did not want to cause a scene. Ewan observed that the fish were not turning so much as arriving at their destination. Sigrid confirmed there were more like it. Hakon came over and narrowed his eyes at the pile. The three of them did the quick, grim arithmetic of survival. The smokehouse was full, the salt was low, lower than usual, which was already low. Salt had become a personality in Ravenbay. It appeared in every plan and every complaint. It was blamed for every disappointment. It was praised when it showed up, as if it had feelings. Hakon did the leader thing. He rearranged worry into shapes that looked like decisions. They would smoke what was worth smoking. They would eat what would not betray them. They would trade for salt. Ewan asked what happened if the salt did not appear. Hakon replied that they would become creative. Nobody liked that word. Chores began because chores did not wait for strategy. Ewan carried water. He split wood. He helped haul a beam to the shipyard. Bram Pike was there, built like a walking tree and speaking like a man who had formed deep emotional bonds with timber. Bram complained that the planks were drying too fast. that the heat pulled pitch out of the wood like gossip from a bored aunt. Ewan told him it sounded like a tragic poem. Bram treated that as an insult to the ship, which sat on blocks near the water beneath a rough awning. It was a coastal trader, not a longship built for glory. Ravenbay had little use for glory. It had use for barrels, rope, and men who could count. Ewan was not a warrior. He had fought once and concluded that fighting was a loud argument where nobody listened. His value to Ravenbay was his ability to read marks, do sums, and notice when people lied with their eyebrows. That was why Sigrid kept finding him. By midday the heat had settled over everything. The air above the dirt shimmered. The smell of the midden drifted in, proud and sour. Flies gathered in cheerful crowds, delighted to be included in the season. Ewan sat in shade and chewed dried bread that had the personality of bark. Children played by the stream, splashing and laughing in the one place that still felt like mercy. In the afternoon, Father Alden arrived with a small pack and a patient expression. He travelled with merchants and hoped to improve souls. Ravenbay was not certain what to do with him, but he was polite and he could write. That made him useful. Alden offered a blessing for peace, the way travellers often did, as if peace could be carried like a small gift. Ewan answered that the day would decide what kind of peace was available, and the settlement would take whatever portion it could get. Hakon gave Alden a place to sit and something to drink that did not immediately offend the body. Alden spoke softly with Sigrid about trade routes and rumours. He listened to Bram complain about weather as if weather was a moral failing. As evening approached, the fishpile became harder to ignore. Sigrid and 2 others carried the worst of it to the edge of the midden. They worked with calm efficiency, because disgust was a luxury, and luxury was for another life. Hakon called a meeting by the fire ring, where the settlement gathered when something mattered. People arrived with bowls in their hands and tired faces. Nobody expected miracles, they expected plans. Hakon spoke steadily about what the heat was doing to the stores. Rations would tighten, more fish would be smoked, nets would go out at night when the water was cooling. The ship would sail for trade. Someone asked who would trade salt when everyone wanted salt. Sigrid answered that Ravenbay still had hides, amber, iron nails and wool that did not itch too much if you were strong. Ewan quietly suggested that the wool should not be the first selling point. Sigrid agreed, and in that agreement was a promise that Ewan would speak less at the market. Bram said the ship could go wherever the sea agreed. Hakon set the plan with practical clarity. The ship would leave in 3 days. Bram would prepare her. Sigrid would choose trade goods. Ewan would count what they had and what they could lose without becoming ghosts. Ewan noted that it was his favourite assignment. Hakon treated that like a compliment. After the meeting, Ewan walked with Sigrid to the storage shed. The sun still lingered in the sky, as if it enjoyed watching people sweat. Sigrid explained the simple truth. They needed salt more than comfort. Without salt, they could not preserve enough for winter. Without winter stores, the settlement would become hungry in a way that turned neighbours into enemies. Ewan asked where they would trade. Sigrid listed the options. Orkney if the sea was kind, York if the ship held together, Dublin if they wanted to be robbed politely. Ewan admired the variety. Sigrid replied that survival was always a list of expensive choices. Inside the shed, the air was cooler. It smelled of wood, rope, and faint grain sweetness. Sigrid lit a lamp and began pulling down sacks. She told Ewan to count with his eyes, not his hopes. Ewan assured her his hopes were very small, which was how he kept them safe. They counted. Grain less than expected. Dried peas a decent amount. Smoked lamb still good. A barrel of sour ale that could be used as drink or weapon depending on the day. Salt, almost nothing. Ewan made marks on a board, then paused to let the worry settle into his bones properly. He pointed out that they could do everything right and the summer could still stay hot. Sigrid agreed, and added that they would do the right things while sweating. Night came slowly. The sky stayed bright too long. The sea made its steady sound, patient and indifferent. Hakon stood by the shore, looking out at the dark water. Ewan joined him because silence was sometimes the easiest form of loyalty. Hakon reminded Ewan that he had been in worse places. Ewan admitted that he had been younger then, and had believed worse places were temporary. Now we believed worse places were just places, and people lived there anyway. Hakon said they would get through the summer. Ewan agreed, adding that they would complain, sweat, and survive out of spite. Hakon preferred duty. Ewan conceded that spite helped duty stand up straight. The longhouse filled with the smell of thin stew. People ate quietly. Children fell asleep with their heads on folded cloaks. The fire dimmed. Outside, the summer night stayed warm, as if it had forgotten how to be night. Ewan lay down and listened to breathing around him. He thought about salt, rot, and the moods of the sea. He thought about how a settlement survived by making small decisions every day, then pretending those decisions were ordinary. Tomorrow would bring more heat, more counting, more work. Ravenbay would endure it the way it endured everything, with steady hands and a careful kind of sarcasm. Chapter 2. Smoke and Polite Lies. Morning returned again, because morning always returned. Ewan suspected it did so out of habit rather than kindness. The air inside the longhouse was already warm, and the fire had not yet been fed. Outside, the sky was clear in a way that promised another day of heat. Clear skies were beautiful until you remembered what they meant. Sigrid was awake early, moving around the cooking space with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly how much food was left and did not intend to discuss it with anyone who enjoyed optimism. She suggested that people eat slowly because it made food last. Ewan called it the first poem of the day. Sigrid advised him not to encourage her. Breakfast was thin porridge with dried berries that had been generous once, back when spring had felt normal. People ate anyway. Hunger did not care about mood. After breakfast, the smokehouse became the centre of the settlement. It was a low building of stone and timber, blackened inside from years of careful burning. On cold days it was a blessing. This year it felt like a small sun with a bad attitude. Bram adjusted hooks and checked the roof fence. Sweat made his hair cling to his head. He looked over the fish laid on boards, some fresh, some already suspicious, and reminded everyone that smoke could do a lot, but it was not a miracle. Ewan agreed and privately wished for a miracle anyway, because wishing was still free. Sigrid arrived with herbs and a small sack that sounded like disappointment when it shifted. Salt was stretched with juniper and patience. Hope was not included, because hope spoiled faster than fish. They worked in steady rhythm. Fish were cleaned, rubbed, and hung. Smoke curled around them, carrying the promise of preservation. Outside, flies circled in thick, lazy loops, offended that their meal had been moved into a guarded building. Ewan stepped out for air that was only slightly less smoky, and saw the midden crew at work. Nobody volunteered for midden duty. People were assigned. It was the kind of task that built character, meaning it made a person more quiet and less trusting. Ingrid Marsh stood with a shovel, her stance wide, her expression stern. She observed that the midden was growing. Ewan replied that everything was growing this summer, including regret. Ingrid noted that if regret could be used as fuel, Ravenbay would be warm forever. They both treated that as comfort. Father Alden approached at a careful distance, admiration in his face and caution in his breathing. He remarked on their endurance. Ingrid replied that endurance was freed. Alden added that their humour was also free. Ingrid clarified that it was not humour. It was survival with a sharp edge. By midday, Hakon called for the store's audit. This was the part of leadership nobody sang about. There were no heroic verses about counting sacks of grain while sweat ran down your back. There should have been. It required courage of a particular kind. They gathered in the storage shed. Sigrid set out the board with marks. Ewan brought his own notes scratched on wood, because paper was for people who could afford to waste it. Hakon asked for plain truth, and Sigrid provided it. Grain would last if portions were cut. Dried peas would last if no one pretended they were a feast. Meat was limited. Fish would be the main food. Salt was nearly gone. Without salt, they would lose the ability to preserve for winter. Silence followed. Even the shed seemed to listen. Bram suggested they could fish more. Sigrid agreed and pointed out that it would still spoil if they could not treat it. Alden asked about neighbours. Hakon answered that neighbours were hungry too. Ewan added the calm truth that when everyone was hungry, trade became less about fairness and more about who grew desperate first. Hakon replied that Ravenbay would not be desperate first. It was a good plan. Plans were the easy part. Later, a small boat arrived from the north. 2 men rowed and a third sat in the stern with a bundle wrapped in cloth. The settlement gathered at the shore with curiosity and caution. Visitors brought news, trade, or trouble, often all three. The visitor introduced himself as coming from Stonewick, a neighbouring settlement inland by a river bend. Stonewick and Ravenbay traded sometimes and argued sometimes, like cousins who cared just enough to be offended regularly. The visitor offered opportunity, which was a word people used when they wanted something that belonged to you. He revealed a small pouch of salt, not much, but enough to matter. He offered trade. Sigrid asked what Stonewick wanted. The visitor wanted hides, ale, strong iron nails, and a promise. The promise was about grazing. Stonewick wanted agreement that Ravenbay animals would not cross into the river meadow this season. The river meadow was good grazing, especially in a dry summer. Everyone wanted it. Everyone also claimed they had always used it. History became flexible when grass became scarce. Tension rose softly, like a rope being pulled slowly. Voices stayed calm because calm voices were safer. The visitor was offered food and rest. He ate politely, as if he was not hungering. That was another reason to distrust him. Hungry men did not pretend. That evening, Hakon gathered a small group by the fire. Sigrid, Bram, Ewan and Ingrid sat close. Alden listened from the edge without intruding, which was his most useful skill. They weighed the choice. Salt mattered for winter. Grazing mattered for living long enough to reach winter. Stonewick wanted to use fear as a lever. Ewan suggested trading for salt without accepting the meadow demand. Instead, Ravenbay could offer practical help that Stonewick also needed, and tie any grazing restraint to mutual behaviour, so nobody could pretend it was surrender. Hakon shaped the offer. 2 hides, some nails, no ale, salt in return, no meadow promise. Instead, Ravenbay would help repair Stonewick's smokehouse vent, and both settlements would keep animals close for the rest of this moon. Mutual restraint, mutual benefit, less pride damaged. The visitor returned to the fire and listened. His smile cooled. He called Ravenbay hungry, as if hunger made them simple. Sigrid replied that hunger made them careful. Stonewick agreed, but demanded that help arrive within a week. Hakon agreed. Hands clasped. The salt changed owners. It was not much, but it was something. In a hard year, something was a treasure. Later, Ewan walked in the yard with Ingrid. The air was still warm, heavy with the scent of smoke and sea. The settlement felt slightly calmer, like a person who had found a small coin in the dirt and decided the day was not entirely cursed. Ingrid observed that Ewan spoke like someone who had done this before. Ewan admitted he had watched people bargain over bread, and that it was never about bread. Ingrid asked what it was about. Ewan answered with the list nobody liked. Fear. Pride. The need to believe anyone controlled anything. Ingrid looked toward the longhouse where firelight flickered through the gaps. She said they controlled their work, and that was enough. Ewan agreed. It was the kind of truth that helped people sleep. Inside, Sigrid measured the salt into small portions, dividing it like a sacred offering. Bram rubbed his hands, satisfied for the moment. Hakon sat quietly, shoulders easing, allowing himself Fart's small breath. Alden spoke to Ewan near the doorway and noted that Ewan carried the settlement on his mind. Ewan replied that someone had to, because it was heavy. Alden suggested that faith could help. Ewan agreed and added that salt also helped. They both treated that as a reasonable exchange. The longhouse settled into night. People lay down close, sharing warmth they did not need. The fire dimmed. Outside, stars were clearer. The air was still too warm, but a faint hint of change lingered. A whisper that summer might eventually remember it was not in charge forever. Ewan closed his eyes and listened to the familiar sounds of breath, wood creaking and distant waves. Every day in Ravenbay was a negotiation with the world. The world insisted on being harsh. Ravenbay responded with steady hands, calm voices, and enough sarcasm to keep despair from getting comfortable. Chapter 3: Wood Gossip and Dry Throats. The next morning arrived with the same bright confidence as the day before. and Ravenbay greeted it with the same tired suspicion. Heat did not feel like an event anymore. It felt like the new law, the kind that had not been voted on but still demanded obedience. The shipyard became the settlement's comfort place, which was a strange choice because the shipyard was mostly splinters, tar, and the steady reminder that everything useful also required work. Still, it was work with a purpose you could see. A plank went on, a seam got sealed, a rope got replaced. The idea of leaving Ravenbay for a while became less like fantasy and more like a plan with calluses. Bram Pike was already there, crouched by the hull with a small knife and a look of concentration that suggested he was negotiating with the wood. He treated the ship as a living creature with moods. This was partly superstition and partly good practice. People who respected ships tended to return. Ewan joined him with a bucket of water and the faint hope that the bucket was not needed for drinking. Bram talked about the planks the way other men talked about neighbours. This board was proud, that it was stubborn. That seam wanted attention. The pitch was too soft in the heat. The pegs were swelling in the wrong places. The ship, according to Bram, had opinions about all of it and was not shy about expressing them through inconvenient leaks. Ewan listened and offered small comments that sounded supportive. This was safer than arguing with a man who could lift a beam and did not mind proving it. Sigrid arrived later with a list in her mind and a basket on her arm. She had the kind of focus that made people step aside without realizing they had done it. She moved through the shipyard and looked at the cargo space like someone planning a siege against hunger. She had chosen trade goods that made sense, hides that were cured properly, wool folded tight and tied clean, small pieces of amber that caught the light and made people forget how poor the rest of their life was, a bundle of iron nails from Bram, the strong kind that held wood together when weather tried to pull it apart. Ewan watched her arrange the goods, and he felt the familiar mix of admiration and mild fear. Sigrid did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The settlement listened to her because she made the numbers behave. Hakon came down to the shore, glanced at the ship, and looked out toward the water. His face did not change much, but his eyes narrowed in the way they did when the world was trying to cheat him. The stream that fed Ravenbay had grown thin. It still ran, but it ran like a person saving breath. The shallows were wider, the stones were exposed, the water tasted warmer than it should, and warm water always carried more opinions than anyone wanted. People began to talk about water the way they talked about salt, with too much attention and not enough joy. Buckets went out more often, drinking became more careful, washing became a luxury, tempers started to itch. The heat did not spoil fish, it spoiled patience. Ewan heard the first argument near the stream. It was not dramatic, it was worse. It was quiet and sharp, a disagreement over who had filled a bucket first, who had stepped too close, who had been careless. It ended quickly, because nobody had the energy to carry anger for long, but it left a trace. In the afternoon, Hakon called for a work shift that was really a calming ritual. Nets would go out at night, as planned, because the water was cooler then and the fish were less likely to arrive already half committed to turning. A barrel would be cleaned and dedicated to water only, no sour ale, no clever reuse, no jokes. A guard would be posted at the stream during peak times, not to threaten anyone, but to remind everyone to behave like neighbours. Ewan thought it was a sensible plan, which meant it would annoy someone. Sensible plans always did. Near evening, a small group arrived from a settlement farther along the coast, a place called Northmere. They came on foot with packs and dry faces. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man named Carden Flint, carried himself like someone who expected the world to argue with him. Northmere had always been friendly enough. Friendly enough meant they traded sometimes and did not raid each other, which was a high standard in any age. Still, friendly enough could turn into not friendly very fast when food became a personal issue. Carden brought the complaint without decoration. Northmere claimed that Ravenbay boats had been casting nets too close to their waters at night. Ravenbay, according to Northmere, was getting desperate and getting greedy. Hakon met him near the fire ring. The gathering was casual in form and serious in meaning. A few elders lingered. Bram pretended to be busy nearby. Sigrid stood in easy listening distance. Ewan stayed close, because he had learned that calm sarcasm was most useful when it arrived early. Hakon kept his voice level and his posture relaxed. He acknowledged that the sea was shared. He also suggested that Northmere might be confusing Ravenbay nets with the nets of men who did not belong to either settlement. The coast had more travellers this summer, more small boats looking for easy gains. Hunger attracted opportunists the way smoke attracted insects. Carden did not like that answer. He wanted something more solid. A promise, a boundary, a gesture that could be carried home and shown like proof. Ewan stepped in with the simplest truth. If Northmere and Ravenbay started fighting over fish, they would both lose, and the only people who would win were the strangers drifting along the coast with empty eyes and hopeful hands. He offered a practical idea. Ravenbay and Northmere could set a shared night fishing schedule for the next stretch, and they could place a marker line on the water that both sides agreed to respect. It was not perfect. It was better than pride. Sigrid added that schedules were boring, which was why they worked. Bram added that the sea did not care about boundaries, but men did, and men were the ones causing trouble. Carden listened, still tense, but less certain of his anger. In the end, Northmere accepted a temporary arrangement. The marker line would be set. The schedule would be followed. Both sides would pretend this was how they had always done it. Everyone would go home and tell their people that they had stood firm. That is how peace was made in hard seasons. Not with victory, with exhaustion and practical compromise dressed up as confidence. After Northmere left, Ravenbay held a small feast. Calling it a feast was generous. It was a morale meal, a deliberate act of community. Thin stew became a shared bowl. A few pieces of smoked lamb were sliced small so the flavour could travel farther than the meat. Someone brought out dried berries, and for a brief moment the longhouse smelled like something other than smoke and worry. Ewan sat near the fire and watched people eat. Children leaned into their mothers. Old men told stories that were mostly complaints with good rhythm. Women exchanged news and measured each other's faces for signs of fear. Alden was there too, quiet and attentive, learning the shape of Ravenbay without trying to force it into his own ideas. He offered gentle words when they were useful and held silence when silence was better. Hakon ate little. Leaders always ate little during trouble. Sometimes it was strategy, sometimes it was guilt, sometimes it was performance. Either way, it did not help the leader's mood, which was the kind of detail nobody discussed openly. Later, when the meal ended and people settled down, Ewan walked outside. The air was still warm, but the sky had softened, and the sea breathed in and out with its usual patience. The ship sat in the dark like a promise that might keep its word. Sigrid joined him near the shore. She did not speak much at first. She did not need to. Presence could be conversation. Ewan admitted that the settlements were beginning to scrape against each other, not because they wanted to, but because hunger made everyone feel cornered. Sigrid agreed. She also pointed out that Ravenbay had one advantage. It had a ship that could move, and it had people who could work without waiting to feel brave. Bram came down too, carrying a coil of rope like it was a pet he intended to keep. He reported that the ship would be ready. It would complain, but it would be ready. Hakon stood with them and looked out at the dark water. The plan was still the plan. The ship would go, they would trade, they would bring back salt and grain if the world allowed it. And if the world did not allow it, they would return with whatever else could be turned into winter. Ewan thought about the feast, about the thin stew and the small laughter, and he felt the strange truth of harsh life. People did not survive on food alone. They survived on the belief that tomorrow might be managed. Ravenbay would manage it, not gracefully, not heroically, but steadily, with hands that kept working even when the mind was tired. Chapter 4. The Inland Road and the Damp Lesson. Council Day arrived with heat that felt personal, as if the summer had noticed Ravenbay specifically and decided to test it. The elders gathered early, because early was the only time the air still remembered how to be cool. They met near the fire ring, even though nobody wanted a fire nearby. Tradition had a habit of ignoring comfort. Hakon sat with the elders and listened to the same problem from several angles. The stores were low. The stream was thin. The fish were unreliable in the heat. Neighbours were tense. The ship would leave soon, but the sea was its own ruler and did not accept schedules. Ingrid Marsh spoke first, with the blunt clarity of someone who had survived enough seasons to stop pretending. She wanted rations tightened now, not later. She wanted strict water rules and no exceptions. She wanted the settlement to accept discomfort early, so winter did not arrive like a surprise. A younger man argued for more hunting inland, as if the forest had a hidden cellar full of polite deer waiting to volunteer. Bram pointed out that the forest had been hunted already. The animals were not foolish. They moved away from hungry people. Animals had excellent judgment. Sigrid offered the most practical suggestion. They would send a small group inland to check old grain contacts, places where small farms might have extra sacks that could be traded for ironwork or cloth. It was not as grand as sailing to York. It was not as risky as waiting for miracles. It was a simple attempt to patch a leak with whatever was on hand. Hakon agreed. A small group would go today. They would travel light, move fast, and bring back whatever they could. The ship was still the main plan, but a settlement could not place all its hope on one hull. Ewan was assigned to go because Ewan had become the official person for tasks that required calm thinking and the ability to count without crying. Sigrid would go as well because Sigrid could smell dishonest offers the way dogs smelled food. Bram stayed behind to keep the ship moving toward readiness. Alden asked to join, partly out of duty and partly out of curiosity. Hakon allowed it because Alden could write agreements and because sometimes a cleric made strangers behave a little better. They left after the council, walking inland along a worn path. The land rose gradually. The trees thickened. The air changed from salt and smoke to pine and damp earth. It should have been refreshing. It was, in a way, but the heat followed them like a shadow that refused to detach. They passed small clearings where people had tried to farm the stubborn soil. Some fields looked tired, some looked burned at the edges, the plants taking on the colour of surrender. The season had been wrong here too. As they walked, Ewan listened to the small rhythm of travel, boots on dirt, the soft creak of straps, the quiet breathing of people saving energy. Travel always invited reflection, which was a rude habit when you were already worried. Alden moved with steady patience. He did not complain. He also did not pretend travel was romantic. He looked like a man who had read about journeys and then been introduced to blisters. Sigrid kept her eyes forward. She spoke little, which was normal for her. When she did speak, it was always about what mattered. Water locations, the time they would need to return, the trade goods they had brought and what they could afford to give away. By midday, they reached a small farmstead near a bend in the river. It belonged to a man named Ellis Ward, a careful farmer who had traded with Ravenbay before. He met them with polite caution and offered them water that tasted slightly of iron and relief. Ellis did not have much grain to spare. His stores were low too. He had lost part of his harvest to mould after a sudden wet week, the kind of summer storm that arrived like an apology and left like a punishment. He showed them the storehouse, and the lesson was clear. The roof had leaked. The sacks near the wall were dark and soft. Grain had clumped together, warm and spoiled. The smell was the same as Ravenbay fish in a different language. Sigrid did not react with surprise. Surprise was for people who still believed the season would behave. Ellis offered a small amount of dried beans and a few jars of honey, valuable and heavy, but not the grain Ravenbay needed. He asked for iron nails in exchange and a promise that Ravenbay would bring salt if they found it, because the inland farms suffered too when preservation failed. Ewan agreed to the trade. It was not much, but it was honest, and honesty was a kind of wealth. They continued to another contact farther on, a small storage site near a larger hall that served several farms. The building looked solid from a distance. Up close, it revealed its floor. The wood around the base was dark with damp. The air inside was thick and sour. The hall steward led them in, apologizing before he even spoke, which was never a good sign. A batch of grain sacks had been stored too close to the ground. The damp had crept in. Then the heat had arrived and done the rest. Whole sacks were lost. Others were questionable. the kind of questionable that turned into sickness if you tried to be brave. Ewan watched the steward try to explain it like it was an accident that could be argued with. Sigrid listened and then turned the situation into numbers. How much was still good? How much could be spared? What trade would make it worthwhile to share? They secured some grain. Not enough. Still something. Enough to justify the walk and keep the settlement from feeling helpless. Alden offered to write a simple agreement, a few lines that recorded the trade and the promise of future salt if possible. The steward agreed quickly. People liked writing when hunger was involved. Writing made the world feel organized even when it was not. On the way back the sky shifted. Clouds gathered without drama, thickening slowly like a thought forming in the distance. The wind picked up, then stopped, then picked up again. The air grew heavy with the smell of rain that had been teased for days. Then the storm arrived. It was not a violent storm in the storytelling sense. It was the more annoying kind, sudden and thorough. Rain fell hard enough to soak clothing quickly and the path turned slick. Water ran in little streams down the ruts, and every step became a careful negotiation with mud. Ewan found the timing almost funny. The settlement had been worried about drought. The world responded with rain that made travel miserable and did nothing to fix the long-term problem. The stream would swell for a day, then shrink again. The heat would return, the mold would celebrate. They pushed on, because there was no other choice. The packs grew heavier as cloth absorbed water. The grain sacks were protected as best they could, wrapped and held high, but Ewan knew that every drop was a risk. Grain did not need much encouragement to spoil. Sigrid moved with the same steady pace as always. Alden struggled more, but he kept going. Nobody teased him. Teasing was for comfortable days. By the time they reached Ravenbay, the rain had eased into a steady drizzle, the kind that made everything look the same colour. The longhouse roof smoked faintly where the fire inside fought to stay alive. The settlement looked weary and familiar, as if it had been waiting for them with patient irritation. Bram met them near the shipyard, eyes quick on the sacks. The grain was brought into the storage shed and opened for inspection. Some sacks were fine, some were damp at the seams, but still usable if dried quickly. Sigrid immediately organised a drying plan, spreading cloth, moving sacks, turning the shed into a temporary workshop of prevention. Hakon came to see what they had brought. He looked at the pile and did the same leader thing he always did. He rearranged disappointment into a shape that could be carried. It was not enough, but it was something, and something mattered. That evening, as the rain softened and the air finally cooled, Ravenbay felt a small lift in mood. Water buckets were filled again, not because the drought was solved, but because the stream was briefly generous. The fire burned with less strain. People sat closer, not from cold, but from habit. Ewan sat near the doorway and listened to the rain tap the roof. Alden sat nearby, drying his sleeves and looking thoughtful. Alden offered quiet comfort, the kind that came from believing the world had meaning even when it was unpleasant. He spoke of patience and community and the strength of routine. Ewan accepted the comfort without arguing. In hard seasons, people collected whatever helped. Some collected faith, some collected salt, some collected sarcasm and called it wisdom. Sigrid checked the grain once more before sleeping, as if vigilance could keep it honest. Bram returned to the shipyard even after dark because the ship was still the main plan, and plans did not like being ignored. Hakon stood by the fire and watched his people settle. He did not smile much. He did not need to. The settlement was still they. It was still working. It had not given it. That was the closest thing to joy a leader was allowed to show. Outside, the rain faded to a whisper. The air cooled further, and for the first time in days the night felt like night. Ewan lay down with damp hair and tired muscles, and the strange calm that came from doing something, even when it was not enough. Ravenbay had brought back grain and honey, and a few jars of stubborn hope. The summer was still wrong, the neighbours were still tense, the ship still needed finishing, but the settlement had moved, had acted, had refused to wait politely for disaster. That refusal was its own kind of strength. Chapter 5. The Sea as a Coworker. Ravenbay spent the next days preparing the ship with the focused energy of people who knew that hope needed carpentry. The summer heat pressed down as if it wanted to watch. It warmed the tar until it smelled sweet and sharp, and it softened the rope fibres until every knot felt slightly suspicious. Even the gulls sounded irritated, as if the whole coast had agreed that sweating was now a communal hobby. Bram Pike treated the ship like a patient with a complicated temperament. He checked every seam. He tapped boards with a knuckle and listened for the dull note that meant trouble. He warmed pitch in a small pot, stirred it carefully, and applied it with the solemnity of a priest making an offering. In another life, Bram might have been gentle. In this life, gentleness was saved for tools and wood, because wood was the one thing that could snap without warning and punish you for carelessness. Ewan helped where he could. He held planks in place, carried buckets, and tried to avoid becoming tar-decorated. Tar had a way of turning a person into a permanent lesson. It did not wash out easily. It also clung to skin like it had chosen you. Sigrid Vale supervised the cargo with the quiet authority of someone who could look at a pile of goods and see the shape of the winter. She did not jet-pack what was valuable, she packed what was tradable. There was a difference. Some things were precious but too personal to part with. Other things were less loved but more tempting to strangers. Survival required learning the difference between what you wanted and what you needed. She chose hides that were cured clean and folded flat, wool that was sturdy and only mildly insulting to the skin, amber pieces small enough to be carried easily and bright enough to make a tired merchant remember that beauty still existed. Bram added his best iron nails, wrapped in cloth so they would not rattle, and announced themselves to anyone with opportunistic thoughts. Hakon Ashridge kept the outward calm of a man who refused to be impressed by the weather. He assigned tasks in a steady voice and made sure the families left behind had a plan for daily work, rations, and water rules. He also made sure the night fishing schedule with Northmere was honoured because the coast did not need a second argument. Ravenbay could not afford to lose energy to pride when it was already spending energy on staying alive. Alden helped in the way Alden always helped, by being quietly useful. He wrote short agreements on scraps of parchment when trade needed a record. He checked the small medicine bundle that travelled with the ship, mostly herbs and bandages, and the belief that treating problems early was smarter than pretending they did not exist. On the morning of departure, the air was cooler than it had been, just enough to feel like a gift. The sea lay calm, its surface smooth and indifferent. Calm seas made people brave. Calm seas also made people forget that the sea could change its mind without notice, like a powerful neighbour with a fragile ego. The crew was small. Bram went because nobody trusted the ship without him. Sigrid went because trade without Sigrid was just a story about regret. Ewan went because someone needed to count and to notice the small lies that hid inside polite smiles. Alden went because Hakon believed the writing would matter, and because Alden had insisted that faith did not excuse a person from doing actual work. Hakon stayed behind. Leaders stayed. That was the rule. It was not always fair, but fairness was not the settlement's main resource. As the ship pushed off, Ravenbay stood on the shore and watched. People raised hands in farewell. Some faces tried to look confident, some did not try. Children ran along the waterline until the ship gained distance and their legs surrendered. Ewan stood near the stern and watched Ravenbay shrink. The longhouse roof smoke became a thin line. The shipyard awning became a smudge. The storage shed became a small dark shape that held everything that mattered. He told himself the distance was temporary. He told himself the ship would return with salt and grain, and maybe some dignity. He told himself many things. The sea listened politely and offered no response. The first day was easy, which was never comforting. Easy days made you feel like the world was cooperating, and cooperation from the world was not a reliable habit. The wind was steady, the sail held, and the hull cut the water with a sound that was almost soothing. Almost. Bram watched the rigging and spoke to the ship with the tone of a man reassuring an anxious animal. Sigrid sat near the cargo, checking ties and knots like a person guarding a sleeping child. Alden looked out across the water and seemed both awed and quietly concerned, as if he had just remembered that water was not naturally meant to be so large. They slept in turns, because sleep on a ship was never complete. The sea moved under you, and your body spent the night negotiating with it. The best you could do was rest lightly and wake often enough to remind yourself you were still alive and still heading somewhere. On the second day, the heat returned. It lay over the water like a thin blanket. Even out at sea, the air felt heavy. Ewan had always thought of the sea as cold. This summer refused to be the usual summer. They passed small boats along the coast, some fishing, some travelling, some simply watching. Men on the other boats looked at them with the expression of people measuring value. It was not hostile. It was worse. It was practical. Bram kept the ship farther out than usual. Distance was a kind of safety, and Bram loved safety the way some men loved adventure. By the third day, the outline of Orkney appeared, low dark land against a pale sky. The sight brought relief, but also a new worry. Land meant people. People meant trade. Trade meant negotiation. Negotiation meant discovering how expensive hunger had become. They entered a small harbour that smelled of seaweed and smoke. Boats were tied along a rough quay. Merchants moved between them like insects in a busy nest. Voices carried across the water, sharp and energetic. Orkney felt louder than Ravenbay, more crowded, more practiced at commerce. Ewan stepped onto the quay and immediately felt the difference between a settlement that survived and a settlement that traded. In Ravenbay, every object was judged for usefulness. In Orkney, every object was judged for profit. It was not evil. It was just a different religion. Sigrid led the way because Sigrid did not get distracted by noise. She found a stall run by a man named Colin Hart, a trader with a clean beard and eyes that smiled while the rest of his face stayed careful. Colin greeted them warmly, which meant he already wanted something. Sigrid displayed their goods without theatrics: hides, wool, amber, nails. Colin touched each item like he was testing a story for truth. He praised the hides. He praised the amber. He praised the nails as if he had discovered they were made by elves with excellent discipline. Then he offered prices that were not prices so much as insults delivered gently. Ewan watched the exchange and admired Sigrid. She stayed calm. She did not react to the first offer, which was a way of showing Colin that she had survived worse than his imagination. She countered with numbers that made sense. Colin responded with numbers that made him happy. The bargaining continued, a slow dance where each step was designed to look polite and feel painful. Alden stood slightly behind, observing. He looked like a man witnessing a complicated ritual. Bram pretended not to care, but his eyes kept moving toward the salt sacks like a thirsty man looking at a well. In the end, Sigrid secured salt, not as much as she wanted, but enough to matter. She also secured a small amount of grain. Orkney had grain, but Orkney also had its own plans for winter. Traders did not sell security cheaply. They paid with hides, nails, and a piece of amber that Ewan felt sure had been in someone's pocket for comfort at some point. Sigrid did not hesitate. Comfort did not preserve food, salt did. They moved on to a second trader for more grain and found the same problem. Supplies existed, but everyone wanted them. The heat had reached here too. People spoke of spoiled stores, thin streams, and a summer that did not behave. Ewan listened and felt the uncomfortable unity of hardship. Ravenbay was not uniquely cursed. It was simply living in the same world as everyone else. They spent the afternoon gathering what they could, weighing each purchase against cargo space and the risk of spoilage. Heat made even newly bought grain feel fragile. Sigrid insisted on checking sacks for dampness and smell. Merchants acted offended, then accepted it because this year had made everyone cautious. Near evening they discovered the next problem. Some of the fish they had brought for travel had begun to turn. The heat had done its work again. It did not care that the fish were on a ship and not on land. It did not care that the fish were meant to be a safe food between harbours. It only cared that time was passing and warmth was winning. Bram cursed in a low voice that sounded like a prayer to the wrong gods. Alden looked away because even calm people had limits. Ewan felt the familiar irritation. They had travelled to save their stores, and their stores were still trying to betray them. Sigrid did not waste emotion. She made a decision. They would replace the fish with something more stable, even if it cost too much. Better to spend now than to be forced into desperation at sea. They bought dried bread, hard enough to be used as building material, and a small amount of smoked meat from a woman who looked like she had never trusted anyone and had been correct about it for decades. The price made Ewan wince. The woman did not care. She had seen the future, and it was hungry. As night came, they returned to the ship and anchored in the harbour. The water was calmer here, but the noise of Orkney carried late, voices fading slowly as if the town did not want to sleep. Ewan sat on deck and looked up at the stars. Sigrid sat nearby, tying down the new sacks of salt and grain. Bram checked the lines again, because Bram did not believe in luck. Alden wrote a short note of the trades, blowing on the ink as if he could keep it from fading by sheer concern. Ewan thought about Ravenbay, about Hakon standing by the shore, pretending calm, about Ingrid enforcing rations with the gentle threat of being right, about the stream running thin and the flies celebrating. He spoke quietly, not to perform, but to settle the mind. They had salt now, they had grain. Not enough to end all worry, but enough to shift the balance, enough to let winter become a challenge rather than a sentence. Sigrid agreed in her own way, by tightening the last knot and sitting back with the posture of someone who had completed a necessary task. The sea rocked the ship gently, like a lullaby delivered by something that could also drown you without apology. Ewan let the motion soothe him anyway. Sometimes you accepted comfort even when it came with conditions. When sleep finally arrived, it arrived carefully, the kind of sleep that kept one ear open. Chapter 6: York and the Loud World. They left Orkney early, because early departures felt wise even when they were mostly superstition. The wind shifted in their favour, and the ship moved south with steady intent. The cargo was heavier now, the hull sat lower. Bram watched the waterline like a man watching a child near a cliff. The sea stayed calm, but the air remained warm. Ewan found the combination unsettling. Warmth belonged to land, in his mind. At sea, warmth felt like the world breaking its own rules. After days of coast and open water, York announced itself in the distance long before they reached it. Not with sound, at first, but with signs. More ships, more smoke on the horizon, a faint haze that clung above the land like a permanent breath. Then, as they drew closer, sound arrived. A low background roar, like a great animal asleep but dreaming. York was larger than Orkney, and larger than anything Ravenbay would ever become, even in its most ambitious fantasies. The river carried boats like a road made of water. The docks were thick with people. Goods moved everywhere, barrels rolled, carts creaked. Voices rose and fell in a constant argument that seemed to be the city's natural music. Ewan stepped onto the dock and felt the small shock of being surrounded by strangers. In Ravenbay you knew every face, every gait, every mannerism. In York, faces slid past like a stream. Nobody cared who you were unless you carried something worth taking. Sigrid moved forward with the calm of a person who refused to be intimidated by crowds. Bram stayed close, eyes scanning, because Bram did not trust cities. Cities had too many corners for trouble to hide in. Alden looked around with the careful interest of a man who had read about places like this, and now had to admit that words did not fully capture the smell. York smelled of smoke, river mud, cooked meat, wet wool, and human ambition. It was not unpleasant. It was simply too much. They found lodging in a small yard run by a woman named Mavis Crow, who took payment up front and question later. That was honest commerce. Mavis gave them a corner of a shed, dry enough, and a warning to keep their hands on their own goods. She said it without drama. It was the same way Sigrid spoke about rot. Facts did not need decoration. Then the real work began. They went to the market where every stall seemed to shout in its own way. Sigrid looked for salt cellars first, then grain, then anything else that could be turned into winter. York had salt in larger amounts, but York also had more buyers. Competition was a kind of hunger that wore nicer clothing. Ewan watched merchants smile with their mouths and measure with their eyes. He watched hands hover near purse strings. He watched young men drift too close, then drift away when Bram shifted his stance. Bram did not have to threaten anyone. His shoulders did the speaking. Sigrid found a grain seller named Thomas Wren, a thin man with quick hands and the expression of someone who had learned to survive by never standing still. Thomas had sacks of barley and rye. He also had a story about why his grain was worth more than anyone else's grain. He spoke of quality, of careful storage, of a cousin who knew a priest who had blessed the harvest. Ewan listened and quietly translated. Thomas wanted more money, and he was willing to invent holiness to justify it. Sigrid did not argue with the story. She argued with the numbers. She offered a fair trade in goods and coin. Thomas countered. Sigrid countered back. The dance continued. Ewan added weight where he could, pointing out calmly that Ravenbay nails were strong, that hides were clean, that amber was rare, and that if Thomas wanted to keep his grain moving, he should accept a deal that did not require the buyer to be foolish. Thomas looked offended at the suggestion that buyers might avoid foolishness. Then he looked at the goods again and made the sort of concession that allowed him to claim victory later. They secured more grain. They secured more salt. They also secured dried peas because peas were humble and reliable, and Ravenbay had learned to respect humble, reliable things. The problem was cargo space. Every purchase demanded another choice. More salt meant less grain. More grain meant less room for anything else. The ship could not carry the whole city, no matter how comforting that would have been. Sigrid solved it the way she solved everything, by prioritizing what would keep people alive and ignoring what would merely make life pleasant. Pleasant was not the goal this year. Surviving was. During a brief rest, they sat in the shade of a wall and ate bread that tasted like dust and determination. Ewan watched the crowd and felt the small tension of being far from home. In a crowd, you were less protected by reputation. In Ravenbay, stealing from someone meant stealing from the whole community. In York, stealing from someone was just a job some people did. Alden spoke softly about the size of the world. York was proof that life could be loud and still continue. Ewan agreed, and privately decided that loudness was overrated. As the day wore on, news travelled through the market like smoke. Rumours mostly, but rumours had value. They spoke of trouble along coasts, of bands of hungry men moving from place to place, claiming whatever they could, of disputes between settlements over water and grazing, of a summer that had shifted patterns and made everyone slightly desperate. One rumour landed heavier than the rest. Someone mentioned unrest farther north. Not a war, not a grand event with a clear name, just unrest. The kind that meant neighbours arguing more sharply than usual, the kind that meant opportunists growing bold, the kind that meant a settlement like Ravenbay could be tested while its best traders were away. Ewan felt his stomach tighten. Sigrid noticed immediately, because Sigrid noticed everything that mattered. They could not confirm the rumour, they could only feel its weight, and weight changed decisions. Bram insisted they finish their purchases and leave as soon as practical. He did not trust the city, and he trusted rumours even less, because rumours often became real when you ignored them long enough. Sigrid agreed to move quickly. Not recklessly. Quickly. There was a difference. Reckless choices were expensive. Quick choices were sometimes necessary. They spent the evening loading the ship, tying down sacks, counting bundles, and checking the weight distribution. Bram made adjustments and muttered about how a ship could feel imbalanced like a person felt an insult. Alden wrote down the final trade list with careful lesson. He did not record goods, he recorded promises. This sack owed to that trader, this coin paid, this agreement made. Writing did not stop betrayal, but it made betrayal harder to deny. Ewan went to the river edge and looked at the water moving past the city. It carried scraps of wood, bits of straw, and the faint smell of everything upstream. Rivers always moved towards somewhere else, never stopping to check who needed them. Ewan respected that honesty. He returned to the shipyard side where Bram was finishing the last checks. Sigrid stood with arms crossed, watching the cargo like a guard. Alden tucked his writing away and looked tired, his eyes showing the strain of noise and crowd. Ewan spoke quietly about the rumour. Not with panic. Panic was loud and unhelpful. He spoke the way he always spoke when worried, with calm sarcasm carefully folded over the fear. If Ravenbay was facing trouble, then this was not the year to linger in a city admiring how busy it was. This was the year to get home, unload salt and grain, and let the settlement breathe again. Sigrid agreed. Bram agreed more strongly, in the way a man agreed when he wanted to stop talking and start moving. They slept lightly, then departed before the market fully woke. The ship slipped into the river current and out toward open water. Behind them, York continued without noticing. That was the strange part of cities. They did not miss you, they simply replaced you with the next person. As the city faded, Ewan felt a small relief. The air opened up, the horizon widened, the sea waited, indifferent as always. They carried more supplies now, they also carried more urgency. Ravenbay was no longer not a place they belonged to. It was a place that might be, depending on their return sooner than planned. The ship turned north and the wind caught the sail. Bram watched the lines, Sigrid watched the cargo, Alden watched the sky, Ewan watched the water and thought about the quiet longhouse and the thin stew and the stubborn people who would be pretending calm until the ship returned. The sea rocked them gently, like it wanted to convince them that everything was fine. Ewan did not believe it. He accepted the gentleness anyway. In harsh years you took comfort wherever it was offered, even from a world that usually charged interest. Chapter 7. Wet Grain and Quiet Urgency. The ship left York with the kind of speed that was mostly emotional. Sails can only catch what the wind offers, and the wind is not impressed by human worry. Still, the crew moved with urgency in their bones. The cargo was heavier now, and so was the feeling that home might need them sooner than planned. For the first stretch, the sea behaved. It lay flat and calm, as if trying to convince them that rumours were only stories, and stories did not change anything. Ewan accepted the calm, but did not trust it. Calm weather in a hard season was like a stranger smiling too warmly at a market stall. It might be honest, it might be a distraction. Bram watched the rigging as if the ropes were thinking about betrayal. Sigrid watched the cargo as if sacks could grow legs and wander off in the night. Alden watched the sky with the quiet seriousness of a man who still believed the heavens had a plan, even if the plan included discomfort as a teaching tool. Ewan watched everything else: the sea surface, the distant coast, the small boats that appeared and vanished like thoughts. He watched the way other crews looked at their ship, how eyes measured the hull and the load, how a head tilt could mean curiosity or calculation. They kept their distance from the coast when they could. Bram preferred open water where fewer people could drift close under the excuse of friendliness. Friendly boats sometimes came with friendly hands, and friendly hands sometimes tried to help themselves. On the second night, the air shifted. The heat eased slightly, and a new smell came in, sharp and metallic. Storm weather. It arrived the way it always did, first as a suggestion. A low bank of clouds on the horizon, a small restlessness in the wind, a change in the way the sea reflected the fading light. Bram adjusted the sail early, because Bram believed in respect. He believed that ignoring warnings was an insult to the sea, and insults were expensive. They tightened ropes, they checked knots, they moved loose items below. Sigrid rechecked the sacks, and added extra cloth wraps where she could. Grain was their treasure now. Salt was their treasure too, but salt tolerated water better. Grain did not forgive. Alden moved carefully, doing what he was told without needing to be praised. Ewan noticed that and quietly approved. Useful calm was the best kind of calm. The storm arrived after midnight. It was not a storybook storm with dramatic lightning and grand speeches. It was the more realistic kind. Wind that pushed and pulled with impatient hands. Rain that came sideways. Waves that rose higher than they had any right to, given how calm the sea had been earlier. The world changed its tone without asking permission. The ship rocked and groaned. The hull took the water with steady effort, but the crew could feel the strain. Bram stayed near the lines, adjusting constantly, his movements precise and practiced. Sigrid stayed near the hatch, listening for the sound that meant water had found its way inside. Alden braced himself and held on, murmuring words that might have been prayer or might have been a polite request to the universe. Ewan held a bucket and did the unglamorous work of throwing water back out when it came in. There was no pride in it. There was only the simple truth that water belonged outside the ship, and if it disagreed, someone had to argue. The storm lasted through the night and into the early morning. When it finally eased, it did not stop. It simply became tired. The wind softened, the rain thinned, the waves lowered to something that could be managed without constant negotiation. The sky stayed grey, the air was cooler now, which felt like mercy until they checked the cargo. Some water had gotten in, not enough to sink the ship, but enough to matter. Cloth wraps were damp. A corner of wine grain sack had darkened. Sigrid opened it carefully and inspected the grain with the seriousness of a person examining a sick child. Some of the grain was wet. Not all, not ruined, but wet grain was an argument that only got worse if you ignored it. Ewan felt the familiar irritation of being punished for doing everything right. They had prepared, they had tied down, they had wrapped. The sea had still delivered a lesson. Sigrid did not waste time on emotion. She began planning damage control immediately. When the sun returned, even briefly, they would open the hatch and air the sacks. They would spread damp grain thin on cloth. They would dry it as best they could. They would accept that some loss was the price of travel. Bram listened and nodded, then returned to the hull to check for leaks. The ship had held. That mattered. A ship that held in a storm was a ship that deserved respect, even if it complained loudly while doing it. Alden offered to help with drying and sorting. His hands were not used to ship work, but willingness was worth something. In harsh seasons, you did not reject willing hands just because they were clumsy at first. They made slow progress north. The sea stayed unsettled but not angry. The sky remained moody. The wind shifted often, forcing Bram to adjust course like a man arguing politely with a stubborn relative. Days passed in a rhythm of watch, work, and careful resting. The crew did not talk much, not because they were angry, but because each person was holding energy close. Speech spent energy, silence saved it. When they stopped near the coast to rest and check bearings, Ewan looked toward land and felt the strange pull of home. Ravenbay was not a comfort place this summer, it was a workplace. It was also the what place where every face would know them and every worry would be shared instead of guessed. As they moved closer, small signs appeared. More smoke along the coast than usual. A few boats travelling in pairs instead of alone. A cautiousness in the way fishermen watched strangers. Ewan remembered the rumour in York, and he felt the tightness return in his stomach. Rumours were often wrong. They were also often early. The world liked to warn people, then pretend it had never done so. On the final night before reaching Ravenbay, they anchored in a sheltered bay to rest. The air was cooler now, almost normal. The stars appeared, sharper than they had been in days. The sea rocked them gently, as if apologizing for the earlier temper. Ewan sat on deck and listened to the quiet. Bram slept in a posture that suggested he was still guarding the ship in his dreams. Sigrid lay near the cargo, one hand resting on a sack like a happard. Alden lay wrapped in a cloak, his face tired but peaceful. Ewan thought about Hakon. He imagined Hakon walking the shore, counting days without admitting he was counting. He imagined Ingrid enforcing rations with the calm certainty of someone who did not care if people liked her. He imagined children running errands, still laughing because children always tried to laugh, even when the world was heavy. At dawn they sailed the last stretch. Ravenbay appeared as a familiar line of shore, a shape that made the chest loosen slightly. Smoke rose from the longhouse roof. The shipyard awning was still there. The storage shed stood like a stubborn box. The stream glittered in the morning light, thin but moving. People spotted the ship and gathered at the shore. The reaction was not loud, Ravenbay did not waste sound, but the movement had a quickness to it. Relief had its own speed. Hakon stood at the front of the group, hands clasped behind his back, posture steady. He waited until the ship was close enough that the faces were clear. Then he let his shoulders drop slightly, just enough to reveal the truth. He had been holding his breath. The ship grounded gently and the crew stepped onto shore. Feet on land always felt strange after sea travel, like your body had to remember a different kind of balance. The greetings were quiet and close. Hands touched shoulders. A few quick embraces happened without ceremony. People looked at the sacks on the deck and tried to read the future from them. Sigrid began directing unloading immediately. Salt first, then grain. Keep the damp sacks separate. Do not let anyone open them until the shed is ready. Do not let children poke at them out of curiosity. Curiosity could spoil food as effectively as heat. Ewan carried sacks and watched faces. He saw relief. He also saw the tight expressions of people who had been managing trouble while the ship was away. Hakon walked with Ewan toward the longhouse, away from the crowd. The air smelled like smoke and wet earth. The storm had reached Ravenbay too, and the ground held the memory. Hakon spoke quietly, not with panic, but with the blunt honesty of a leader who had been taking small hits every day. There had been visitors, not traders, drifters, hungry men with boats and tired eyes. They had tested the shore once, coming close at dusk, looking for weakness. Ravenbay had met them with calm firmness and enough people standing together to make the message clear. There had been no fight worth describing. The drifters had moved on to look for easier places, because opportunists preferred soft targets. Still, the test had shaken the settlement. It had reminded everyone that hunger did not always arrive as a private problem. Sometimes it arrived wearing someone else's boots. Northmere had held to the night fishing schedule, but the mood along the coast had grown sharper. Stonewick had kept their grazing close, mostly, but there had been a day when goats appeared near the meadow line and everyone pretended not to notice, until Ingrid noticed and decided nobody would be pretending anymore. Water had dipped lower, then risen slightly after the storm. The stream was still thin, the flies were still cheerful. The smokehouse had stayed busy. The salt from Stonewick had helped, but it had been stretched so thin that even the idea of salt felt tired. Ewan listened, absorbing the update like a man accepting a heavy pack. He did not act surprised. Surprise was not useful. He asked practical questions instead. How were rations? How were tempers? How was Bram Apprentice doing with the shipyard work? How were the children? Hakon answered as best he could. Ravenbay was still Ravenbay. People complained, worked, and survived. Some days were harder, some nights were restless. Nobody had given up. They returned to the shore where unloading continued. The salt sacks were carried into the storage shed like sacred objects. The grain followed. Sigrid oversaw everything with the calm intensity of someone who refused to let joy make people careless. When she inspected the damp sacks, she did not scold the sea. She did not blame Bram. She simply began planning. Damp grain would be dried immediately. The longhouse would lend space. Cloth would be laid out. A watch would be set so the grain was turned regularly and kept away from curious animals and curious children. Alden offered to help and people accepted without comment. In hard seasons, help mattered more than identity. That evening, Ravenbay held a small welcome meal. Not a celebration, a recognition. The ship had returned. Supplies had arrived. The settlement had taken a breath. Ewan sat near the fire and ate slowly, not because he wanted to make the food last, but because his body had forgotten what it meant to be still on land. Around him, people spoke in low voices. News passed from mouth to mouth. The settlement reassembled its shared story. Sigrid spoke with Ingrid about ration adjustments. Bram explained the storm to a small group, mostly using gestures and a tone that suggested the sea had behaved badly and should apologize. Alden listened and nodded, offering a quiet word here and there that soothed rather than corrected. Hakon sat with the elders and accepted their question. How much salt? How much grain? How much loss from damp? How far would the supplies stretch? The question were not accusations, they were survival doing its accounting. Late that night when the longhouse quieted, Ewan stepped outside. The air was cooler, closer to normal. The stars were clear, the sea sounded calmer, as if it had also decided to behave for a while. Ravenbay was still under pressure, the summer was still wrong, neighbours were still tense, opportunists still wandered. But the settlement had more salt now, more grain, more options. Options were a kind of peace, at least for a little while. Ewan looked toward the dark line of the storage shed and felt the strange comfort of responsibility. It was heavy. It was also proof that he belonged. Chapter 8. The Careful Reshaping of a Tired Village. The days after the ship's return were busy in the way busy always was in Ravenbay, steady and practical. There was no dramatic shift. There was only the slow rearrangement of life around the new reality. A settlement did not survive by sudden inspiration. It survived by routine, tightened and refined, until the routine became a shield. Sigrid organized the drying of the damp grain with the focus of someone conducting a quiet orchestra. Cloth was laid out in the longhouse during the warmest part of the day. Grain was spread thin, turned often, and guarded from dogs and children. People complained about the smell, because drying grain had a dusty sweetness that stuck in the throat. Sigrid reminded them that the smell was better than the smell of spoilage. That ended the complaints quickly. Ingrid enforced water rules with calm consistency. Buckets were filled in assigned turns. Washing was limited. Anyone caught being careless with water received a lecture that felt like being weighed and found foolish. The lecture was not loud, it did not need to be. The shame did the work. Hakon kept the settlement working in coordinated shifts. Smokehouse duty rotated, night fishing followed the schedule with Northmere. A small watch was kept at dusk, not because Ravenbay expected trouble every night, but because expecting nothing had become too expensive. Ewan found himself in the familiar role of moving between group, smoothing edges before they became cuts. He did not enjoy it. He was good at it, which was worse. The main tension arrived in a predictable shape: grazing. The river meadow line with Stonewick had been quiet enough, but quiet enough did not last when animals were hungry and grass was scarce. One afternoon a small group from Stonewick arrived at the edge of Ravenbay land, leading goats and wearing expressions that tried to look casual. They claimed the goats had wandered, they claimed it was an accident, they claimed they would retrieve them quickly. Their faces did not match their claims. Ingrid saw them first because Ingrid noticed anything that threatened balance. She walked out with two other elders, her shovel resting on her shoulder like a reminder that tools had many uses. Sigrid followed because numbers were at stake. Hakon came too, because leaders had to appear when borders grew blurry. Ewan came because Ewan had become the person who translated anger into agreements. The meeting took place in a strip of grass that everyone pretended was neutral. The Stonewick men spoke with calm voices and soft smiles that asked for permission, without admitting they were asking. Ravenbay listened with calm faces and stiff posture that refused permission without admitting it. The goats did what goats always did. They ate grass with complete confidence, as if grass was their right and not the subject of human drama. Ewan listened to the Stonewick explanation and found it familiar. It was the same shape as every border dispute. Accidents that happened to benefit one side. Mistakes that always leaned in the same direction. Hakon responded with restraint. The agreement had been made. Both sides would keep animals close for the rest of the moon. Ravenbay had already sent help to repair the smokehouse vent as promised. Ravenbay had held up its side. Stonewick would do the same. The Stonewick men made another soft claim. The meadow was wide, grass was plentiful, surely there was room for a little flexibility, surely neighbours could share. Ewan almost admired the attempt. Almost. Sigrid provided the simple truth. There was no plentiful grass this summer. There was only grass that someone needed. Sharing was possible when everyone had enough. When nobody had enough, sharing required structure, not smiles. The Stonewick men shifted tactics. They hinted that future salt trades might depend on goodwill. They hinted that Ravenbay might find itself isolated if it insisted on strict lines. Ingrid reacted with a look that could have curdled milk. Hakon remained steady. Sigrid remained calm. Ewan stepped in, because this was the moment where pride could turn a small dispute into a season-long bitterness. Ewan offered a compromise that did not give away the meadow. Stonewick could graze along a rocky strip closer to the river bend for 3 days, not in the prime meadow, but in the less desirable stretch. In return, Stonewick would provide 2 days of labour helping Ravenbay reinforce the storage shed base with stone and raised planks that would protect grain from damp and reduce spoilage risk. Mutual benefit, practical exchange, less pride involved. The Stonewick men did not like being offered worse grass. They also liked the idea of refusing and returning home empty-handed even less. They accepted. The goats were moved, the labour was scheduled. Everyone pretended this had been friendly cooperation the whole time. That evening, Ravenbay worked on the storage shed improvements. Stones were carried, planks were set to lift sacks off the ground. Bram oversaw the work with satisfaction, because Bram loved anything that involved wood behaving properly. The Stonewick men worked too, with the quiet grumpiness of men who believed they had been out-negotiated but could not admit it. Ewan watched the work and felt the subtle shift. Hard seasons did not only create conflict, they also forced people to build better systems. Systems were not exciting. Systems kept you alive. During the following days, Sigrid introduced a new method of preservation, born from necessity and a slight irritation with how fragile food could be. She took small amounts of salt, mixed it with crushed juniper and a bit of sour ale, and used it as a rub for thin slices of fish and meat. Then she dried the slices on racks placed high in the longhouse where smoke drifted naturally. It was not full smokehouse curing, it was not full salting, it was a middle path, using what they had and multiplying its effect. People were skeptical at first, because people always were. New methods made them nervous. Nervousness was another form of hunger. Sigrid did not argue. She produced the first batch, let it dry, then offered small pieces to the elders. The flavour was sharp, smoky, and surprisingly pleasant. More importantly, it did not spoil quickly. The method spread through the settlement in the quiet way useful knowledge always spread. Not as a grand announcement, as imitation. A neighbour tried it. Another neighbour improved the rack design. Someone added herbs. Someone else stopped adding herbs after realising the herbs were a luxury they could not afford to waste. The method stabilised into a shared practice. Bram built better drying racks. Ingrid assigned turning schedules. Hakon included it in the ration plan. Alden wrote it down, because sometimes writing helped a good idea survive beyond one person's memory. Ewan watched this and felt the rare emotion of cautious optimism. Not the bright kind that made people careless. The grounded kind that made people keep working because it might actually help. The settlement still had soft tension. Night watches still happened. Neighbours were still touchish. The stream still ran thin. But the mood shifted slightly. With more salt and more grain, with better storage, with a new preservation method, Ravenbay gained the ability to plan more than a day ahead. One afternoon, a small act of kindness cut through the usual hardness like a thread of warmth. Alden had been teaching a few children simple letters, not as a grand education, but as a quiet habit. He did it by scratching marks in dirt with a stick, turning learning into a game. Most adults pretended not to care. Adults often pretended not to care about anything that could be taken away. Ewan watched from a distance, then noticed a child named Lysa standing apart, hesitating. Lysa was small and serious. The kind of child who listened more than she spoke. She had lost her mother earlier in the summer to illness, not described in dramatic terms, just the ordinary unkindness of life. Since then, Lysa had moved like a shadow, doing chores without complaint and avoiding attention. Alden invited her closer with a gentle gesture. Lysa hesitated, then stepped forward. The other children made space without being told. That was the kindness. Not loud, not performed, simply done. Ewan felt something loosen in his chest. Harsh life did not remove tenderness. It just made tenderness quieter. Later, Sigrid handed Lysa a small strip of the new dried fish, the improved kind, and guided her toward the best spot by the fire. Ingrid adjusted the cloak on Lysa's shoulders without comment. Hakon nodded once when he saw it, the kind of nod leaders gave when something went right, and they wanted to acknowledge it without turning it into a spectacle. That night, the longhouse felt slightly different. Still smoky, still crowded, still tired, but the air carried a faint sense that the settlement was not only enduring, it was adapting. Ewan lay down and listened to the familiar sounds. Breath, wood creaking, distant waves. He thought about the goats and the negotiation, about how close pride had come to turning into a bigger problem. He thought about the raised planks in the storage shed and the drying racks near the rafters. He thought about Lysa stepping into the circle of children, guided by simple patience. Harsh seasons demanded a certain kind of strength. Not the dramatic kind, the steady kind. The kind that built racks, turned grain, shared small pieces of food and chose compromise over stubborn anger. Ravenbay did not feel safe. It felt workable. In this summer, workable was a gift. Chapter 9: Cold Promises and Far Horizons. Late summer began to loosen its grip, not out of kindness but out of habit. The days were still long, but the air carried a faint edge in the morning that made people pause and inhale as if they could taste the coming change. The stream ran a little steadier after the storms, though nobody trusted it. Trust was for seasons that behaved. Ravenbay moved into the next phase of survival, the part where you stopped reacting and started preparing. Preparing did not feel hopeful. It felt like hauling stones and counting sacks. Still, it mattered. Winter did not arrive suddenly. It arrived done small decision at a time. Sigrid kept refining the new preservation method until it became routine. Thin strips of fish and meat rubbed with a careful mix of salt, juniper, and a touch of sour ale, hung high where smoke drifted naturally, turned regularly, watched closely. It was not elegant, but it worked. People started speaking of it as if it had always existed, which was the highest compliment a village could give. If a new thing felt old, it meant it belonged. Ingrid kept water rules steady and predictable. Predictable rules calmed people even when the rules were strict. The stream was guarded during busy hours, buckets were filled by schedule, washing remained limited. Complaints happened, then faded. Even complaints got tired. Hakon watched the coast and the mood of neighbours. The drifters did not return, but the memory of them stayed like a bruise. Ravenbay kept a dusk watch and a night watch, not because they expected trouble every night, but because being ready cost less than being surprised. Ewan found himself walking between all of it, an observer who had been promoted into usefulness. He helped track stores, helped settle small disputes before they grew teeth, and helped Hakon with quiet decisions that leaders preferred not to announce. Leadership was not only about being seen, it was also about being careful. One evening, Hakon gathered a small group in the longhouse after most people had settled. The fire was low. The air smelled of smoke and drying grain. Children slept in a heap like kittens. Adults spoke in low voices as if loud sound might wake the winter early. Hakon laid out the next choice. They had salt and grain now, at abundance but enough to work with. The question was whether to risk another voyage before winter fully closed the sea. A final trade run could turn enough into safer enough. It could also go wrong. The sea did not promise anything. Sigrid supported the idea, with strict conditions. If they went, they would go for goods that held value through winter. More salt, more grain, more dried peas, maybe a barrel of dried apples if they found them, because apples were the kind of luxury that made life feel human. They would not chase fancy items. Fancy items did not feed children. Bram supported it too, because Bram always trusted a ship more than he trusted a hungry season. The ship had been repaired and reinforced. The seams were tight. The rigging had been checked and rechecked. Bram spoke of the hull as if it had gained wisdom from the storm. Alden was cautious, not fearful, just aware. Autumn travel carried risks, shorter days, sharper storms, colder water that punished mistakes. Still, caution did not mean refusal, it meant planning. Ewan listened and considered the map of possibilities. York was far, Orkney was closer but might be stripped of surplus by now. Dublin was still Dublin, and Dublin did not pretend otherwise. There was another option, less crowded, less predictable, and strangely tempting. Iceland. Iceland was not a market city. It was a scattering of settlements built by people who had looked at the edge of the world and decided it needed neighbours. It was a place with fewer mouths, fewer merchants, and different needs. Some Icelandic farms had livestock and fish, and some had surplus that could be traded before winter made travel impossible. Also, Iceland carried stories. Stories mattered. People moved on stories almost as often as they moved on hunger. Hakon chose Iceland. The plan formed quickly, because quick planning reduced the time available for doubt. A small crew again. Bram, Sigrid, Ewan, and 2 younger men eager to prove they could be useful. Alden stayed this time, because the longhouse needed him, and because someone had to keep teaching children letters as if the future was certain. The departure felt different than the last one. The settlement had more structure now, more systems, more shared discipline. People had practiced being careful. They knew the watch schedule, they knew the ration rules, they knew the new drying racks and the raised storage planks. They knew how to keep their hands steady when anxiety tried to shake them. Hakon stayed behind again, because leaders stayed. He watched the ship push off with the calm face of a man performing steadiness for his people. Ewan knew him well enough now to recognize the cost of that performance. The voyage to Iceland began with cool air and a sea that looked darker, more serious. The warmth of late summer faded as they moved west. The wind had a sharper smell. The spray felt colder on skin. Ewan welcomed it. Cold at least was familiar. The ship moved steadily, and Bram seemed happier. Bram liked weather that made sense. This weather made sense. It was not kind, but it was honest. They reached Iceland after days of sea that alternated between calm and mood, the way the sea always did. The first sight was land that looked like it had been forged rather than grown. Dark rock, low hills, patches of grass clinging stubbornly, smoke rising from distant hearths, a place built on refusal. They entered a small inlet near a settlement called Ashford Point, an English-sounding name that made Ewan smile because it sounded too polite for such a rough coast. The people who met them were cautious but not hostile. Cautious was the default language everywhere this year. Trade in Iceland was quieter. No crowded market, no constant roar of voices, just people meeting by boats, inspecting goods and speaking with blunt honesty because subtle tricks were hard to sustain when everyone lived close and remembered everything. Sigrid presented their goods. Amber still drew attention, even here. Wool was valued, especially strong wool. Iron nails were welcome because wood and weather fought constantly in Iceland. In exchange, Iceland offered dried fish of excellent quality, smoked meat, and some grain, though grain was rare. More importantly, Iceland offered fat. Seals and sheep provided it. Fat meant warmth. Fat meant cooking that did not taste like sorrow. Fat meant life. They secured a small barrel of rendered fat, traded carefully for nails and a hide. Ewan saw the way Sigrid hesitated before giving up a hide, then did it anyway. Winter did not care about sentimental attachment. Winter cared about calories. During the stay, they heard Greenland stories. It started the way all big stories started, as if it was nothing. A farmer mentioned a cousin who had sailed with a trader. A fisherman mentioned a neighbour who had seen a ship return with strange wood and strange tales. Someone mentioned a distant coast where grass grew in summer and where the sea brought driftwood like gifts. Greenland was spoken of like a place that answered a certain kind of hunger. Note the hunger for food, though that too. The hunger for space, for distance, for a fresh start where old disputes did not follow you down the path. Ewan listened with calm interest and quiet suspicion. Fresh starts were expensive. They required leaving behind what you knew. They required believing that the unknown would be kinder than the familiar. Sometimes the unknown was kinder. Sometimes it was simply different pain. Still, the stories had power. They were stories about possibility, and possibility was the one thing that harsh seasons tried to starve first. Bram liked the Greenland talk more than he admitted. Bram was a shipwright. Shipwrights were always half in love with distance. Ships existed to turn distance into a reachable thing. Sigrid treated the stories as interesting but not urgent. Her mind stayed on practical needs. Ravenbay needed stores, not daydreams. Still, even Sigrid listened when someone described Greenland summers as cooler and steadier than the strange heat that had punished the coast this year. Ewan noticed that. When Sigrid listened, it meant the idea had weight. They stayed only long enough to complete the trade and check the weather. Autumn storms did not wait politely. The sky had already begun gathering that grey look that meant the sea would soon request payment. Before they left, a local elder offered a simple piece of advice, not wrapped in poetry. Do not fight the sea, do not rush. Do not assume a calm morning means a calm day. Ewan found it comforting. Good advice was comforting even when it was obvious. The return voyage began with fair wind, then shifted into harder travel. Cold rain, stronger gusts, waves that rose quickly and slapped the hull like impatient hands. Bram stayed alert and busy, adjusting lines, watching the sail, keeping the ship pointed in the direction that reduced suffering. Ewan worked beside him, holding ropes, carrying water, and doing the uncelebrated labour that kept a voyage from turning into a cautionary tale. Sigrid stayed near the cargo, checking ties and sacks, making sure the barrel of fat stayed sealed and stable. If fat leaked, it would not just be loss, it would be tragedy. They reached the coast again with tired bodies and a ship that smelled like wet wood and stubbornness. As Ravenbay came into view, Ewan felt a familiar looseness in the chest. Home was not easy. Home was known. Known was a kind of safety. The settlement gathered at the shore again, the routines held. Unloading began with the same calm urgency. The new goods were carried into the shed and sorted under Sigrid's watch. The barrel of fat drew quiet excitement, the kind people tried to hide because excitement could turn into disappointment too quickly. Hakon inspected the stores and let a small relief show. It was not joy, it was the easing of pressure, the kind of relief that gave people more week of steadiness. That night Ravenbay sat in the longhouse with a different air. Still smoky, still crowded, still tired, but there was warmth in the knowledge that they had added to their winter. There was also the strange echo of Greenland stories, floating quietly in the background like a distant song. Ewan lay down and listened to breath around him. He thought about the seasons, about how life was a set of negotiations that never ended. He thought about Iceland, about blunt, honest trade. He thought about Greenland, not as a plan, but as a reminder that the world was bigger than the problems of Foss settlement. Bigger did not mean kinder. Bigger did mean possibilities. In harsh years, even the idea of possibility could keep a person steady. Chapter 10. Frost and the Quiet Victory of Ordinary Survival. The first frost arrived on a morning that looked innocent. The sky was pale, the wind was still, the ground sparkled with thin white crystals that made the grass look briefly decorated, as if the world had decided to pretend it cared about beauty. People stepped outside and paused. Frost was cold, yes. Frost also meant the end of flies. Frost meant meat would keep longer. Frost meant the strange hot summer had finally been pushed back by something older and more reliable. Ravenbay did not celebrate loudly. It did not need to. It simply breathed differently. The stream ran clear and colder. Water tasted sharper. Breath became visible in the morning, which made children laugh, because children always found joy in simple evidence that their bodies were doing something. Work shifted into winter rhythm. The smokehouse stayed active, but now it felt like a useful heat rather than a punishment. Drying racks near the rafters did their job more easily. Damp was less eager. Mold had fewer victories. Sigrid ran the winter stores audit with the calm authority of someone reading the future in sacks and barrels. Ewan helped, because Ewan had become a counting tool that could also carry bags. They checked grain sacks and confirmed what was safe. They checked dried peas. They checked smoked meat. They checked dried fish, both smokehouse cured and the newer thin strips that had become part of the settlement's routine. They checked the barrel of fat from Iceland and treated it like a small miracle, though nobody used that word aloud. The numbers were not generous. The numbers were not hopeless either. That was the change. They would still ration. They would still plan meals with care. They would still have days when stew felt thin and patience felt thinner. But the winter did not look like an immediate disaster. It looked like a season they might manage. Hakon called for a community gathering, not a feast, but a settling. People needed to feel the shape of the plan. Plans were comfort. They gathered in the longhouse as the light faded early, the fire burned low and steady. The air smelled of smoke, wool, and food that had been preserved by stubborn hands. Hakon spoke plainly. The summer had been harsh and strange. Stores had been threatened, neighbours had been tense. Drifters had tested the shore, Ravenbay had adapted. They had traded, they had tightened routines, they had built better storage, they had learned a new way to preserve food, they had kept watch without turning interfered. He did not speak of heroism, he spoke of work. Work was the true story of Ravenbay. Sigrid followed with the numbers, because numbers mattered more than speeches. She explained rations for the first part of winter, then the adjustments they could make depending on fishing and hunting success. She spoke of the barrel of fat and how it would be used carefully, not wasted, not hidden, shared in a way that kept the settlement strong. Ingrid spoke too, not with softness but with a kind of plain care. Water rules would continue, waste would not be tolerated, people would watch each other not to punish but to protect. She reminded them that shame could be useful when it kept someone from doing something foolish. Bram spoke briefly about the ship because Bram could not help himself. The ship had served them. It had held through storm and cold. It would be maintained through winter, because a ship neglected in winter was a ship that punished you in spring. Bram treated that as law. Alden spoke last, offering quiet words about community, about small kindness, about how people survived not only by storing food but by storing patience. He did not make it grand, he did not demand agreement, he simply placed the idea in the air like a warm stone. Then, because Ravenbay understood the value of ending things cleanly, they ate. The meal was better than it would have been without the trade voyages, still simple, still careful, but better. Stew thickened slightly with peas. A tiny portion of fat gave the pot a richer smell. Someone brought out honey and used it sparingly, turning plain bread into something that felt almost like a memory of easier years. Children ate with more enthusiasm than dignity. Adults ate with quiet gratitude. Elders ate slowly, watching faces, measuring the village mood the way they measured weather. Ewan sat near the fire and listened. Conversation moved like low water around stones. People spoke of practical things. Nets, repairs, the best place to gather firewood, the animals that might still be hunted before deep snow. They also spoke of small moments from the summer, the kind of moments that became stories later. The storm that soaked the grain, now told with a calmer tone. The Stonewick goats, now told with more humour than anger. The night fishing schedule with Northmere, now told as if it had been wise cooperation rather than a mere dispute. The drifters who tested the shore, now described as a lesson Ravenbay had passed. Hard seasons turned into stories the moment you survived them. That was another quiet victory. It meant the season no longer owned you. You owned the memory of it. Later, when the gathering ended, Ewan stepped outside. The air was cold enough to feel clean. The stars were bright. The sea was dark and steady, making its usual sound, indifferent and familiar. He walked along the shore and looked back at the longhouse. Smoke rose into the night. Light leaked through gaps in the wood. Inside, people settled into sleep, bodies close, breath steady. The village felt smaller in the dark, like a shelter rather than a settlement. That was what winter demanded, shelter. Ewan thought about the summer heat and how wrong it had felt. He thought about rot and salt and the way hunger made neighbours sharp. He thought about Sigrid turning a scarce resource into a working system. He thought about Ingrid holding the line with strict cares. He thought about Bram speaking to the ship like a stubborn friend. He thought about Hakon carrying worry in his chest and still showing steadiness to everyone else. He thought too about Lysa learning letters in the dirt. A small thing, a quiet thing, a sign that people still believed in future days. Greenland stories drifted back into his mind, not as a plan, but as a reminder that the world held more than one path. Some paths led outward, some led deeper into the same place, built stronger. Ravenbay had chosen the second path for now. It had stayed, it had adapted, it had endured. That endurance was not loud, it was not glorious. It did not deserve songs from strangers. It deserved something better. It deserved rest. Ewan returned to the longhouse and lay down among the others. The fire was low, the air was warm enough. The winter had arrived with frost and honest cold, and the settlement was ready in the only way any settlement could be ready. Not perfectly, not without worry, but together. Outside, the sea continued its patient breathing. Inside, Ravenbay slept.